Okay, so we've heard about urban policy and policy implications about elected officials. And so that's what I want to focus on in this talk. If I framed it as a question, that the issue I sort of want to take up is, if we wanted to take some of these ideas about smart cities and implement them in some sort of urban policy, if we wanted to have an impact on urban policy, what are we up against? What might the barriers look like? So I'll just start off with a bit of background. This is a bit of a newer area for me. I typically work on urban transportation and economic networks, but I'm starting to move into political networks a bit. So these are probably some images, some ideas you've seen before. So what we've got here are the Senate and the House in the US Congress. So this is what the situation looked like. The Republicans are in red, the Democrats are in blue, and these are political alliances they form in Congress. So this is what the situation looked like in the late 70s, early 80s. We can see some splits by party, less so in the Senate, certainly more so in the House. But you can even see, some evidence, some Democrats here collaborating with some Republicans in the late 80s. So we see some evidence of polarization, a bit of it organized by political party. And here's what it looked like last year. So it's a bit more extreme. So almost complete polarization, and it's almost completely organized by political party. And we can see some trends. So I'll just highlight two trends in this sort of overall data from the early 80s to last year. So one of them, the green line in these two graphs, we see increasing partisanship. And it's a relatively steady trend over this sort of 30-year span. The shaded bars are changes in majority. So during the gray periods here, we've got a Republican-controlled chamber, white shaded periods, Democratic-controlled chamber. And so it's interesting, we see this steady upward trend regardless of which party holds the majority. So the green line is, the green line is the partisanship. The orange line is the size of the largest faction. So what percent of this chamber was controlled by the controlling party? And we see that that's steadily gone up as well to now be just over 50%. So what this tells us is increasingly these alliances, these collaborations are organized around political party membership. And additionally, the size of the largest faction now has the ability to push through these sort of more extreme agendas. So we're approaching something that we might call or think of as a tyranny of the majority. As polarization increases, we get more extreme rhetoric, more extreme policy, and increasingly that can just be pushed through. So a lot of this we already knew. We see this reported quite a bit. We know that the US Congress is deeply polarized. What we don't know, and what I don't think many people have looked at, is this true around urban and spatial issues? Is there some sort of political polarization when it comes to the urban policy arena? So I'll be focusing on the US context, and maybe we can talk about the extent to which this extends to other contexts. So we can first ask, is there a national urban policy in the United States? I think the answer is mostly no. There isn't anything like a national urban policy. To some extent, Congress may get involved in urban and spatial issues. To some extent, they provide funding, they authorize funding for HUD, but relatively little. But the House of Representatives, to the extent that representatives are linked to specific districts, if there were something about cities, something about spatial issues going on, it seems that we might see it there. And so what I'm doing is trying to dig into some of what we know about the legislation in the US Congress and ask, is there anything to say about urban and spatial issues here? So if there was congressional interest, what we'd look at is bills that are dealing with issues that affect these sort of keywords. Bills that affect urban places, towns, communities, cities, downtowns, metropolitan areas. To what extent is the House of Representatives taking up legislation that deals with these sorts of issues? And it happens a bit. So the y-axis here, we're looking at the percent of House bills that are dealing with these sorts of issues. So it's been more or less steady, a bit of an increase since the late 90s. It accounts for between 1.5% and 2% of all the bills that are being considered in the House of Representatives. So it's still relatively uncommon, but these are the bills that I'll be focusing on when I'm looking at the next couple of slides. So what I'd like to do is use these bills that are sponsored in the House of Representatives to try and understand where are the political alliances among US representatives when it comes to urban and spatial issues. So in the US House and the Senate, a legislator introduces a bill by sponsoring it. Other legislators can sort of advocate for that bill, provide support by co-sponsoring it. And so the typical approach when you see people in this literature looking at political alliances is to assume that there's some sort of political alliance between legislators when they sponsor lots of the same bills. I think there are some problems with this. This doesn't actually give us very good information about where political alliances are. So here's the first problem. Some legislators sponsor lots and lots of bills. So I've got a couple examples here. So Representative Norton, a Democrat representing District of Columbia, sponsored 20% of all of the bills relating to urban and spatial issues in the most recent session of Congress. Likewise, Representative Grijalva, a Democrat representing a district in Arizona, sponsored about 14% of all the bills representing, dealing with urban and spatial issues in that same session. And so it's not at all surprising that Norton and Grijalva both sponsored 10 of the same bills. So just looking at the raw number of bills that these two representatives sponsor doesn't really give us very much information about whether they actually have some sort of a political alliance with each other. So in this case, the first problem is just counting up these co-sponsorships doesn't tell us much about where alliances are. So the second problem with just looking at these raw counts is that some bills are a lot more popular than others. So for example, House Bill 1233 was sponsored by 115 representatives. It was a very popular bill. In contrast, House Bill 1160 was sponsored by exactly 2 people. It was an incredibly unpopular bill. So if we're thinking about wanting to learn about political alliances from these bill sponsorship patterns, in this case, House Bill 1233 gives us relatively little information. Everybody liked it. Looking at House Bill 1160 tells us a lot. It tells us there's likely some kind of alliance, some kind of collaboration between these two representatives because they, in a sense, stuck their neck out to sponsor this very unpopular bill. So we need to take these pieces of information into account when we're looking for political alliances from bill data. So this is the solution I've adopted to try and find these solutions. So it's sort of building a kind of a null hypothesis, a null distribution to decide when legislators likely have alliances with one another. So we have to take into account how many bills each of 2 legislators sponsored. We have to take into account how popular or unpopular each of these bills was and all of the bills that were introduced in that session. And then ask ourselves, how likely would it be that in this example, Grijalva and Norton sponsored the same 10 bills if, under this null hypothesis, they didn't have a political alliance? And so here's a histogram using sort of a simulation type methodology, a Monte Carlo method here, that shows us if we assumed that Grijalva and Norton didn't have any sort of collaborative political alliance, they were just sponsoring bills at random, the number of times we would expect that they would actually sponsor the same number of bills. And so we see that actually it's pretty likely that they would have wound up sponsoring 10 of the same bills. That's not at all surprising. And so the probability that we would see them sponsor 10 of the same bills when they didn't have a political alliance is actually pretty likely. This gives us no information. We have no reason to believe, in this case, that Grijalva and Norton have a political alliance. And so I'll conclude in this case they probably don't. So here's another case. So in this case, I've used Clark and Capuano. So these are representatives that represent districts in the Boston area. So in this case, they only sponsored 3 of the same bills, but they also didn't sponsor very many bills at all. And the 3 bills they did sponsor tended to be pretty unpopular bills. So we get the same sort of histogram over here, the distribution of number of bills we would have expected them to both sponsor if they were just sponsoring them at random. In this case, the likelihood that under those circumstances they'd sponsor 3 of the same bills is incredibly unlikely because they only sponsored 3 bills apiece and they were the really unpopular ones. So we can read into this that likely they do have some sort of a political alliance around these urban and spatial related legislation. So then we can start to dig into this data once we've identified which representatives have these apparent political alliances and ask first, who's participating in this? And one of the patterns that I've noticed is that across this span from the mid-'80s up to the present, Democrats have always participated in these political alliances. They've always collaborated with one another to pass through urban-related legislation. And they've done so much more often than Republicans. So what we've got here is the number of Democrats participating in these sorts of alliances and the number of Republicans participating in these alliances. But the gap is starting to close. So what we see is that in these last few sessions of Congress, Republicans are starting to coordinate among other Republicans in how they sponsor these bills related to urban and spatial issues. So we can also start to look at the structure of these collaborations. So this is the structure of the House of Representatives in the 96th session. So the session taking place between 1979 and 1980. So each of these dots is a representative. They're linked in this network if we believe that they have some sort of political alliance around how they react to urban-related legislation. And what you can see, if you can make out some of the different colors, is there are a bunch of small factions. So we can see a faction here, sort of a large cluster here. And these tend to be formed in this period around regions, so representatives representing districts in the same state or around the same city. In some cases, these clusters represent alliances around a particular issue. It could be housing, it could be economic development, but they collaborate, they coordinate their sponsorship patterns on legislation. So right now the dots are colored based on which factions they're in. We can compare that to which party they represent. And what we can see between these two images is that Republicans and Democrats in this session were forming relatively mixed factions. So what we see is a factionalized network. So legislators are coordinating their action perhaps around geographic location, around issue, but it's not driven by political party. So now I'll contrast it, same kind of network. The dots are still legislators, the edges are still political alliances, but we're now in the 114th session. So this was the previous session of Congress, 2015 to 17. Again, we see there's just two factions. So these form one cluster, these form another cluster. And you can imagine what this is going to look like when I change the colors of the dots so that we can see the Republicans and Democrats. So again, we have a factionalized Congress, but no longer are these factions representing geography. They're not representing issues. They're representing almost entirely political party membership. So we've still got a factionalized political system, but it's now a fully partisan factionalized political system. So we've transitioned from a network, an urban policy situation that's structured around factions to one that's structured around political parties, and we can actually see that grow over time. So what I've got here is a measure of partisanship. So it ranges from 0 to 1, and it tells us what percentage of this factionalization is due to political party membership. So how much of the clustering that we observe in these networks can be explained by which party each person's a member of? To what extent does it approximate this purely partisan network? And again, we can see that there's a general upward trend in this partisanship. So it mirrors what we already know about the US Congress, that we're increasingly seeing a more partisan political system. It's interesting, though, that we see this specifically around legislation that's dealing with sort of broadly urban and spatial issues. So it's also interesting that this partisanship increase has continued even as we see a shift in these chambers' control between Republicans and Democrats. So again, the gray shaded areas, years when the chamber was controlled by Republicans, the unshaded areas controlled by Democrats. So I've also started to think about whether gerrymandering plays any role in this increase in polarization. It doesn't seem to. So if it did, we would expect to see the biggest jumps in polarization in the election cycles that follow redistricting. So these would be election cycles that come just after the decennial census, and we don't see that pattern. So I was surprised by that, but it mostly seems that this is not a process that's driven heavily by gerrymandering and redistricting. But I think it's noteworthy that this seems to be a general increasing trend, not driven by any particular political party either, because we see this increase in polarization regardless of which party is in control. So at this point, some very preliminary conclusions, really more like next steps. But it looks like the trends we already know exist in the general Congress, both in the House and the Senate, toward polarization and partisanship seem to extend even to this very narrow data set that just looks at legislation on urban and spatial issues. It also looks like Republicans are becoming more involved. That is to say, Republicans seem to be getting better at coordinating their sponsorship activity with other Republicans, and they seem to be entering this policy discussion much more than they had in the past. And so I think the impact of this finding is something like, to the extent that we're interested in influencing this urban policy arena at the national level at least, it's going to involve contending with this growing partisanship and contending with specifically a political party form of polarization. So it's not an issue of influencing issue-based factions, it's not an issue of influencing regional factions, it's an issue of influencing political parties specifically. But again, a number of limitations here. So the data is relatively preliminary. The trends, as you can see, are messy because we're not dealing with all that many bills. So like I said, the US House and Senate tend not to take up issues of national urban policy. It's much more local. So we're looking at really very few bills to make these inferences. So at this point, I'm using a relatively simple method for identifying bills that have sort of urban and spatial impact. And that gives us not very many bills to extrapolate from. So I still need to look at the role of redistricting, gerrymandering, but it doesn't seem to have a whole lot of a lot of effect here. So I think I'll leave it at that, and we can talk about it.
Very good, Zach. Questions? Yes, Ed.
I can't really get up at
I
it.
know. Let's just
So that was really fun and informative. So the giant that's not in this room is transportation infrastructure. That's actually the thing. By far the most important thing that the federal government did to cities in the post-war period was the Eisenhower highway system, right? So I would be totally focused on that relative to this little crap which has to do with like Washington D.C. and whatever Mike Capuano and Catherine Clark have cooked up, but you know, I think the basic project is great. There's also a question about whether or not you should be doing more on state legislatures. I mean, states really do have powers to influence cities. So, I mean, I think probably the right thing to do is to do this for transportation as well as urban, and then sort of ask yourself a little bit more about how we understand how, you know, what states are actually doing.
Right, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think looking at transportation, I think the other issue where we see quite a bit of legislation is on housing, and specifically around regulation of various mortgage and lending sorts of things relating to housing. But I think you're right that...
You're absolutely right, and it will have spatial impacts, but they don't even think about the spatial impacts of that. That's not even, you know, they don't understand that the homogeneous interest deduction actually does move people out of cities into suburban areas. So I think it's transportation and maybe the collected earmarks which tend to go along with it, which are more explicitly spatial. That you know.
Yeah, no, I agree. And extending this sort of, using this same sort of method, but looking at state legislatures exactly, you know, if there was going to be an urban policy, I think it's going to be made at that level.
Yeah. That sounds exactly right.
Yeah.
I mean, is there also a way of doing it not in terms of just Dem rep, but like, I was just looking at the scores of Capuano and Clark, and he's like a D plus 34 on one of those things, she's a D plus 18. Could you do more in terms of separating out the, you know, how extreme they are in the left-right spectrum more generally?
You can. So this method, separating them using networks of alliances, maps on relatively well to those political ideology scores. So the sort of different ways of getting at something fairly similar.
Right. I guess I was thinking about sort of, if you took the scores for non-urban stuff and just asked whether or not there was more or less linking for urban stuff across that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Next, Peter. Okay, Mercedes.
Thank you. So I also enjoyed very much your presentation. I totally agree with the prior comment by Ed Glesser. I have a hard time thinking of a federal urban policy, but I can really see a state urban policy, right? In the sense that a lot of the decision power and the resources that relate to cities are at the state level. They're not even at the city mayor level. City mayors have very little power. So I sort of, thinking more about state-related bills, totally agree that that will be important. Then I was a bit puzzled in the way you choose the keywords to identify urban-related bills. I would have thought that something cities worry about is talent, skills, universities, and so I wasn't quite sure why this was versus other, whether you did some placebo, some validation, right?
Right, so these keywords that I'm looking for occur in the titles of the bills. So if it was actually in the text, you would also see words like talent or skill or labor market or things, or university. But the titles are relatively short, between a sentence and a short paragraph. And these are the words that usually crop up because they identify what the bill is pertaining to. And so these are using very little of the actual text of the bill to identify which bills to use in the subsample.
Well, thank you very much, Zachary. It was a very interesting paper. One or two small questions. I recall somewhere in the beginning of the 1980s or so, I once was involved in a discussion, I think in Washington, on what was then seen as a new instrument, i.e. urban impact analysis. And based on, I guess, either a bill or a law, I don't know exactly, but it stipulated that if there is an important federal policy, it is compulsory to look into the urban impacts of any major federal policy. I don't know whether the bill or the law still exists, it doesn't matter, but I recall by then that prompted a whole discussion on the competence and involvement of federal agencies, whatever they may be, on urban systems which belong to a different competence. And I was wondering whether in the findings you have used here from 1979 onward, whether somehow this political discrepancy in terms of what is the competence of federal agencies in urban affairs, whether this has changed, and that might perhaps also explain a little bit the pattern you have found in terms of the Democrats and the Republicans. Very small related question, perhaps I also recall in that time that people said it depends on the type of urban policy. Mm-hmm. Sewage policy could be a typical local thing where there would be no federal involvement. Health might perhaps be different, as we have seen also with Obamacare, etc. So I was wondering whether these elements could have played a role in the pattern over time you have found.
Right, excellent question. So the bills that I'm looking at here, so in each of these sessions, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 bills. And so the urban, the ones that I've extracted as sort of quasi-urban tend to be on the order of 100 to 200 bills per session. So I haven't dug into the actual content of the bills to code them into, say, domains of urban policy yet. But I think that's an important next step to understand what sorts of issues. And I think that might help explain some of these patterns. I'll have to look at the bill that you've mentioned, the urban impact, and see if that's still in effect and to what extent I can use that to help make sense of these.
Good, thank you. Time for one more short one, please.
Thanks. I was wondering whether the clusters that you create in the two periods, in the first case you had many, like 4 or 5 different colors or different issues. In the second case there was only 2 issues. I guess this comes endogenously from the estimation, but does it make a difference to the results you get? So you get more polarization when you have 2 issues than in the first period where you have more issues. And then also you documented that overall in legislation you have this upward trend, and then you show that in urban issues you also have the upward trend. So I wonder whether you can compare the two, because if you control for the fact that all legislation becomes more polarized, then is this urban thing more significant or not?
Right. So I have not done the comparison yet, and I think that's important to ask, is the urban legislation simply mirroring the general trend? I suspect it is, but I think it's interesting that we still see it in the urban legislation because we know that Congress generally doesn't get involved in urban legislation. We might think that these are typically sort of bills that wouldn't drive patterns of polarization. The fact that they also drive polarization, I think, is interesting. The question about the clustering, so in the first version, this is purely endogenous, so this is the modularity maximization solution for the network. In this case, I've computed the modularity if the two parties were the partition. And so my measure of polarization is just how well does this partition explain the best partition. So how well does party membership explain the best clustering of the network.